good evening, and welcome. My name is Michelle Forcier. I use she and they pronouns. I am a board member at Outcare Health, and we are a nonprofit leading the charge for LGBTQIA plus, lots of pluses, health equity in the United States and worldwide. We get really involved with offering resources, support, and education. And so I'm very excited to welcome you today for joining our Outcare talk series, where we're going to talk a little bit about kink affirming conversations. Our webinar series is devoted to discussing diversity and intersectionality within our LGBTQIA plus community. We have many folks from all across the country joining today. We want this to be a really fun and also safe and productive space for our panelists as well as our guests. So feel free and comfortable to ask any question today, and we will have folks monitoring the chat and other places if you have a question and want to participate. All out talks are recorded and can be watched from our website. So if you need to leave or you have so much fun on this, you want to recommend it to a friend, please do so. So I'm very excited again. Kink affirming conversations. We're going to learn lots about the joy and pleasure and wonder of sexual diversity. And I'm going to leave it to the great panelists to let us learn lots more.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so great to have you as part of the Outcare team. It's just wonderful. And my name is John Sovek, and I am your moderator and host for today. I always feel like I should have a special hat for that, but it's just me. And that's the beauty of these conversations. It's just us gathering together and creating a collaborative space where we can talk about these subjects which may show up in your practices. So I welcome all of our listeners today. And I'd also like to personally welcome all of our panelists and give them a moment to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about who they are and what they do, and they get a bonus question that they are hearing for the first time right now. And that bonus question is someone, either past or present, personal or professional, who inspired you in your journey of life. So you have a moment to kind of hold on to that. And let's start introductions. Amy, why don't you introduce yourself and share a little about who you are and the work that you do?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy Jacobs. I use she and they pronouns. I am a clinical social worker at a health system in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I work for an HIV and AIDS treatment program, and I do mostly mental health therapy, but also some kind of general medical social work for people living with HIV and AIDS. I've been doing that work for about 20 years, and I've been doing sexual health work since I was about 15. I started out as a peer educator, handing out condoms to my friends in the hallways. And so I've been talking to people about sex for a long time. Somebody who inspired me, actually, when I was a freshman in college, I had to volunteer, and I volunteered at an HIV agency. And the guy who ran the volunteer department inspired me to work in HIV, and I've been doing it since, and I absolutely love it. And his name's Patrick, and he's probably not watching, but I'll send him the link to the recording later so he knows I gave him a shout out today.
Thank you so much for sharing. Richard, let's hear a little bit from you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Sproat. I am a developmental psychologist. I wear a couple of hats. One is I'm adjunct faculty in the Department of Human Development and Women's Studies at California State University, East Bay. I'm also the research director and co-founder of TASHRA, which is the Alternative Sexualities Health Research Alliance. We formed in 2012, and we've been doing research and clinical education, clinical teaching all around kink and health. And we have a lot of projects going on. You might hear about some today. And recently, I stepped down as president of the Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, which is Division 44 of the American Psychological Association. So I'm also bringing all of that to the table today.
And if you had a person who inspired you.
Person who inspired me. Well, I have to say, actually, the first person that jumped in my head is actually back then, my therapist. I was in the middle back in about 2003, 2004, going, what am I going to do with my life? And we did some really in-depth work where I realized I wanted to bring together my personal life and my professional life. And that kind of got me started at doing work around kink and kink identity, kink sexuality, and kink health.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And that leaves the amazing Hope to share with us.
Hi there. And I am a primary care physician assistant. And I do a lot of gender affirming care, sexuality care, and sort of reproductive health care. I am sort of going into a new phase of my career these days and sort of focusing more deeply on those things. After surviving barely the very, very industrialized healthcare that is the 20-minute visits and rather inhumane. Things that have inspired me. One that is particularly close in my mind and heart these days. Dearly departed former partner of mine, PJ2 Ravens. He is a transgender man that I was with back about 11 years ago. And that was around the time that I was deciding to become a physician assistant. I came from a completely different background. It actually is my second career. I used to work in IT. But just generally seeing the lousy care that LGBTQ and particularly trans and gender diverse patients got at the hands of so-called medical professionals just disgusted me and made me want to sort of go into medicine and be a force for good. I'd always been interested in doing something in healthcare, but it was right around there then that I realized that I needed to do something. So I actually was Lion Martin, that a clinic out in San Francisco that was almost going down for finances, that I got to do a rotation at. So that's me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And once again, my name's John Sovek, pronouns he, him, and I'm a therapist in Pasadena, California, and I specialize in working with LGBTQIA plus adolescents and their families during the coming out process. And I'm also the author of Out, A Parent's Guide to Supporting Your LGBTQI plus kid through coming out and beyond. It came out in April of this year. It's been doing really well, and I'm incredibly proud of it. And I think a place for us to start is, we always do a little welcome, where are people from? And we have people from all over the country listening to us, from sunny Seattle to North Carolina to Massachusetts to Johnson City, Tennessee. And I think one place for us to start with this particular topic especially is, what is kink? How would you help people who perhaps are joining us for the first time, curious, trying to understand what this word that's been very salaciously portrayed in media, what it actually is in real life, and how you might help them understand it on a more personal or in-depth level? Richard, why don't you kick us off with this?
Okay, Mike. In our work, we tend to talk about kink as an umbrella term. It covers quite a lot of very different things. Clearly, there is a good portion of it that is about sort of eroticizing and playing with power and power differences. But part of it is also really about sort of intense sensation, which can include pain, but other types of intense sensation, sensual, sensory sort of experiences. Sometimes it's about trying to reach different states of consciousness. Sometimes people are looking for a real experience that sometimes can border on the spiritual, but definitely sort of peak experiences in the realm of this kind of intense body intense, sometimes sexual arena. And I think often for a lot of people, there is also an important community part to all of that. Not everybody is really aware that kink is actually a community. And it has a history and it has a whole set of things that go with it that really make it a functioning community. I'm sure that's not complete. I was interested in what our other panelists might say.
So to me, I think it sort of depends who you ask, because I think if you ask like a conservative religious person, anything that's not missionary position is kinky in some fashion. I think Richard got it pretty good. I think peak experiences, intense experiences, sort of pushing limits sometimes. I mean, can be everything from very subtle emotional, like humility. I shouldn't say subtle, but very like emotional intimidation or humiliation, or fire play or piercing, or so many different things, or tickling, for instance. That would be like a hard limit for me. I was like massively traumatized by tickling as a kid, so but
Yeah. So I usually when I talk about it, I say kind of BDSM is the practice and kink is the identity. So a lot of people identify as kinky or identify the things that they do as kinky, which is participating in kind of these BDSM activities, which is bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism. And just as Richard and Hope said, that there are these, sensations, both physical sensations and mental sensations and emotional sensations, where we are kind of playing with power dynamics with people. And for some people, it includes sex, and for some people, it doesn't include sex. So there are definitely people who participate in BDSM and have no kind of sexual interactions with anybody when they're participating. So it can be either.
And one of the things that I heard more than one of you mention is this idea of community. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that to understand beyond the interactive part of it, the actual community-based part of it as well, too.
yeah, for
So,
me,
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, kink, I think is one word for it, but the leather community is the sort of the one that I came out of more, which I think is a little bit more used among queer communities, and maybe older kinky crowd. But for me, it's been like my home for probably about 20 years now. I've been like sort of progressively finding like my own tribe. I spent a lot of time hanging out with science fiction folk and sort of Renaissance fair folk, and it's sort of a natural progression. Some of you who've been in those various communities will know that there's a lot of crossover. In fact, my first BDSM experiences were at a science fiction con. But for me, I did want to mention one other sort of thing, Amy, you'd mentioned about it not having to necessarily involve sex. Was, for me, getting into kink was very closely tied to when I was diagnosed with HPV. And it was a type of sex I could have without taking my pants off. And so it was sort of my primary outlet for much of sort of that recovery, and sort of molding of that into my identity, and sort of figuring out how I was going to navigate that sexually. But it's, it can be very sexual, even if it's not necessarily involving genitals.
For sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I very much identify with the kind of sense of community, I guess, when it comes to BDSM and kink. I'm in the Detroit area, and there's a really large kink community in the Detroit area. And I spend most of my time with kinky folks doing vanilla things in my in my social life now. Most of my friends, as an adult person, my best friends that I have now are people that I've met through that community. And we, I just was up north with 3 of my good friends who I met in the community just for an up north trip on a lake this weekend. And so, I do a lot of vanilla things with a lot of kinky people, because of meeting them through that community and having a lot of in common and feeling comfortable talking about sex and sexuality and kink and all of those things. And I make a joke sometime that when I get around other people who work in HIV, I go, oh, these are my people. But I also feel that way when I'm around other kinksters, like, oh, these are my people. These people I feel like I can relate to, I can be myself around, I can make jokes, and I can just be natural around them.
Mhm.
And we have a question from Joshua that came up, and I think it's because of some of the language that we're all hearing used. And they asked, does kink have to be BDSM? Is that an equivalency, or are there other facets to it? Richard, it's yours. Take it away.
Oh no, immediately my answer was, oh no, it's not just BDSM. There are a lot of people who have sort of like connections to communities and activities and fantasies that don't involve, for example, restraint or impact play or something like that, which might result in pain, or sadomasochism or something like that. So, for example, there are people who are part of the whole kink umbrella who will do some sort of like role play. So they'll role play being pups. The pup community is pretty big, especially for, it appears to be, especially for younger gay men, or younger people actually in general in kink. Or sometimes people will do some age play or role play, like pretending to be of a different age, younger often. Again, all of that is sort of like enacting different parts of themselves, different roles, and it doesn't necessarily involve, whips and chains. Sometimes people, as was mentioned earlier, there are what we call in our research, we call them adjacent communities, and these are the science fiction communities or the sometimes Burning Man, sometimes it's different things like Renaissance Fair or something like that, where there is a lot of a lot of role playing, and so that's a big part of it that is part of kink that is not about bondage and discipline and sadomasochism and those things.
My friends and I like to call it sex theater.
Sex
Sex
theater.
theater. We
I
all
like
dress
that.
up and we play roles, just like we did in theater when we were in high school.
That's right.
Or in like, elementary school. And I was going to say not just pups, but there's also people who role play as kitties or kittens, pony play. Oh my gosh, pony play is one of my favorite things just to watch because it gets quite elaborate.
Mhm.
I've always been a fan of equestrian stuff. So
Yes, and then there are those people who are just like in a particular fetish. So
yeah.
there might be a fetish, for a particular type of clothing or a uniform or
Body
a
part.
particular, garment or boots or shoes or something like that.
Or
Wherein,
body.
yeah, where I think again, it's not about BDSM. So that's the long answer to that short question.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's definitely a big umbrella.
Mhm. And one of the things I think by seeing that question is important for us to understand that we've got both medical providers and mental health providers, in our audience today, both live and listening to the webinar later. And what is it that you believe providers are most misunderstanding about the needs of the community when they come into, let's just say, their GP or go into their therapist? What are things that you've either heard or you understand from personal experience that you might be willing to share?
Do the mental health folks want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of misinformation about kinksters and folks who participate. Some big ones that I have heard before are, this is just abuse. It's not actually consensual stuff happening, or this is people playing out their abuse from childhood. So there's a lot of kind of stigma around practitioners and people who participate in this. You may hear that, people who are DOMs or tops are just, finding people that are willing to let them abuse them because they're these awful, horrible people, or people are just reenacting traumatic events from their past when they're, role playing certain situations. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there, and the research shows us actually, and Richard can, correct me if I'm wrong, but the research shows us that folks who participate in kink and BDSM are not, they were not, disproportionately abused as children or sexually abused or experienced sexual assault or things like that. It's pretty on par with the, general population. So those things are all really, damaging myths that folks who are members of the community have to kind of overcome. My childhood was like, Leave It to Beaver. My parents were together my whole life. I had 3 sisters. I grew up in a little suburban area, and my life was pretty perfect. I didn't experience any trauma growing up. And here I am. Richard, what do you think?
Well, I would underline it. The first thing often is, do healthcare providers understand the difference between BDSM and abuse? Because often in our own research, we find that people will not disclose, they will not come out to their healthcare providers because they're afraid exactly of that somebody will call CPS, about their children because they admit that they're into BDSM, or somebody will be worried about going to the emergency room because they're afraid somebody will call the cops on their boyfriend. So I think that really is like the first thing, is understanding the difference between abuse and BDSM. Other than that, we do a lot of work on trying to understand injuries and medical complications, and when people are engaging in kinky activities, and trying to get a handle on that, because I think sometimes people misunderstand the risk involved, or don't understand that in fact there is a community that teaches and mentors all the time about how to lower the risk of injury or medical complication when doing these sort of like what I call the extreme sports of sex sometimes, so I think that sometimes providers can have a misunderstanding of just how risky, or all the different ways that people reduce that risk when they're playing. So that perhaps is like the second one, but that BDSM and abuse is definitely number one.
Yeah. And I would say as a medical provider, often if I'm doing an exam where I see a part of the body that's usually covered, and it's something I'm still sort of working out how the best way to inquire without stigmatizing. But usually what I'll say is, was this mark, did that happen because you wanted it to, or was it intentional or consensual? Or asking something around like, do you feel safe at home in your relationship? I'm glad that there's a lot more sort of global universal screening for things like intimate partner violence, even before we get someone into a room often. So that hopefully there's a chance for people to disclose. It does get difficult, of course, because there's certain injuries that that can be suspicious. I tend to try and err on the side of believing my patient, but there's also a lot of you have to sort of learn how to read people to a degree, because for instance, someone refuses to be interviewed without their partner, or without their partner in the room. So usually, like, if I have serious concerns, I'll be like, hey, you mind if I ask your partner to step out so we can just talk a bit more, and then hopefully give them an opening for if they have any concerns about it, to let those out.
Mhm. So what I'm hearing from all three of you, it is like for the providers to create a deeper understanding of the community and what the actual, not just the activities, but the actual intent behind them is, and to maybe erase some of their preconceived notions, potentially through education. And my hope is that all of you, if you have any resources, could drop them into the chat so we can share that with all of our attendees today. And there's an interesting question that's sitting in the Q&A right now, and I'm going to consolidate it for a little bit. And it really is, as a provider, perhaps through education, are there ways for a provider to understand how to suggest reducing risk for civic practices if those conversations do come into the room? And is that a provider's place to have that information? Is it something they should resource out? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that we can't expect providers to know everything all the time, right? Certain people have certain areas of specialties that they, are particularly comfortable talking about and good at talking about. Hope is a provider I would refer, other kinky people to go see if they were looking for a primary care provider, because I know that she's, kink friendly and aware. So certainly there's word of mouth to particular providers. I don't think that people have to know everything, right? But what I do think that they need to do is know a basic amount of information so that they can comfortably have a conversation with someone. You don't need to know every single thing someone's doing on the weekends at the sex party, but you do need to be comfortable having a conversation with them to make sure that they are getting the resources that they feel they need, right? And that's as simple as, hey, I might not be able to answer all these questions for you, but here is a card for this community, or this is a list of websites that you can go to that are reputable and good, and we know. So it's just like when you're talking to folks about being queer, or you're talking to folks about being LGBTQ, like, you don't have to necessarily be queer yourself to provide good care, right? You just need to know enough so that you are open and you're somebody that they feel comfortable talking to about these things, and you have some basic knowledge and some basic resources to be able to provide people if they need somewhere to go.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in particular, one organization I wanted to plug, National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, I believe it's NCSF Freedom, I think .org. They have a lot of good sort of workshops and educational things on interaction with law enforcement and with child protective services. Yeah, thank you, Chris. And they've done panels and like workshops at some of the kink conventions I've been at. And I also wanted to encourage people, a lot of the kink conventions, which of course with COVID, a lot of them kind of went away, but a lot of them have like really extensive educational panels, where you can learn a lot of things, which can be really beneficial. Sometimes parties will have what they call like, it's almost like a well, bottoms buffet is one of the expressions, where they'll have like people get to try out different sensations with sort of pre-vetted, reputable people who know how to do the various things, sort of like oh, I'm curious about flogging. I'd like to see what that feels like, or about being spanked. You know, so it's gives people sort of a chance to sort of get a taste of things in a safer environment.
There's a ton of organizations like local kink
Yeah.
communities. We have one in Detroit called the Board of Education, and they do classes every other Tuesday about a different thing. So you can go and learn about that. So just knowing something as simple as like, oh, there's an organization close by here that does classes. Here's, you know, their website, or here's information. Maybe they'll be doing a class on whatever it is that you're interested in the next few months.
Yeah, I was gonna say we did have another, oh, it looks like someone answered the question regarding the sounding, I think. Or,
Yeah, that was the one we took and moved into a more general
oh, got it.
question.
Yeah. I was gonna say another thing is if people are looking for resources, people they can refer out to. There's a number of different organizations that have sort of referral networks. Outcare Health has a fabulous one. The Gay and Lesbian Medical Association has a great provider list, as well as trying to think about what other ones, but like WPATH, you know, has a more gender affirming care lens, but there's a lot of crossover. I'm you know, among a lot of things. People are sort of liberal minded. I find, you know, they tend to be more expansive minded and in a lot of different ways. You can't assume it, but you know.
And Richard, I wanted to throw this one to you because it sounds like you have your thumb on the research community. Matthew had put out, they were wondering if there's any research on safe gender affirming kinky sex and how they might find information for that community as well. Any thoughts come to mind for you?
Yes. Generally, the answer is yes. I mean, is there research about? I'm not sure if the question is specifically as like, so what can you do as a kinky person, and if and to do something in a gender affirming way? But it's been noted for actually a really long time that kink is often a space to really explore things like sexual orientation and gender. And so a lot of people will do it. I always kind of go back to, in particular, there's a researcher in Europe by the name of Robin Bauer, who has done a tremendous amount of work on really looking at how gender diverse, transgender people engage in kink and really exploring that in a lot of detail. And it's fascinating because there's so much creativity and there's so much possibility. I'm also often, I believe recently, there's a therapist in New York City, Laura Jacobs, who has also written on this topic quite a lot. And I really like Laura's stuff a lot. So there are things out there. And if people want like more specific details, they can contact me.
Yeah, for safe gender affirming kink sex, a lot of it sort of depends on what you're doing. If you're looking at safe from the sort of the emotional standpoint, I always, when I'm this is more me personally, when I'm having sex with someone or I'm thinking about it, negotiate about, okay, what parts of your body do you like to use? What parts do you not like to be used? What is something that feels good to be touched, you know, not good to be touched? You know, what names do you want for things? As far as like someone who has had bottom surgery, a lot of it depends on what the surgery was, how recent. You know, so one of the things like for regardless of surgery, so someone who is on testosterone, assigned female at birth, so trans male, trans masculine, genderqueer, The testosterone naturally causes like a menopausal shift in the tissues of the vagina or the front hole. So things are much more easily torn and can get bleeding. Also puts you at higher risk for HIV because of that, because of the delicacy of the tissue. So using lubricants very important. You know, if someone has internal sutures from, say, vaginoplasty, you know, you want to make sure that they, you know, that they've healed well. And I'm trying to think what other specific things. A lot of it is about healing. If someone's had breast implants, and this goes for anyone who's had breast implants, whatever their gender, you want to be careful with the impact, especially for like the saline. But it's good to sort of talk about your medical history just in general with your partners, because there's a lot more than just gender history. So like if they have diabetes or, you know, any neuropathy or anything like that, those can affect safety in terms of the scene.
And I want to bring up something that the three of us had talked a little bit before we came online, and you're all here talking with our attendees and being very open about your connection to the community. And Hunter had put up a question that I think is really powerful. And this is the boundaries as a clinician and a member of the community, and how you balance those two. Because in some parts of the country, the communities are small and everybody knows everybody. Even in some of the larger cities, there's still like a lot of like, everybody knows everybody and recognizes people out in the real world. And I wonder if you'd be comfortable sharing a little bit about that with providers who may be part of the community themselves or interested in becoming part of the community, how you manage those boundaries for yourself.
Volunteers?
I think Amy might be able to answer this, but I certainly can
I know you-
report on conversations. I've had a lot of conversations with therapists in particular about this. So Amy, do you want to jump in at all, or?
No, I would like to hear what you have to say
Okay.
first.
So often, I mean, it is interesting because at least with mental health, there is perhaps almost this very intense concern about crossing boundaries and sex with clients, and to the point where, you know, some people might even be, you know, have complaints and be brought up in terms of complaints about their professionalism if they're even in the same space, right? Like at a public dungeon or a public party or something like that. So even being in the room, regardless if you're interacting or not, can sometimes be very sensitive and pretty difficult. I know that a lot of people, especially some older counselors and therapists, would only play if they were across the country, right? Definitely out of town, in order to avoid accidentally running into a client or even a past client. And I find that I'm starting to hear more and more stories, talk about a small community, more and more stories of, I went 3,000 miles away and I still ran into, right, a previous client, or I ran into somebody who is partnered to my client, or things like that. So that in many ways, the whole geographic distance kind of strategy to create that boundary doesn't quite work as well as it used to. So we are kind of left with a lot of people struggling with what are they comfortable with. I've also heard from some therapists, and definitely from some clients, that Actually, there's so much shame around kink. There's so much shame around, our sexual and gender diversity often, that that shame, seeing that like my doctor, my therapist is in the community, and running into them in the community is such an antidote to that shame, that in fact it has a benefit. Now, this is something which I think mainstream sort of vanilla professional organizations may not understand at all, and think, I'm sorry you were in the same place. That is definitely, a violation of your professional ethics. And I think it's important for queer communities to really kind of question that, or at least investigate that, because of the shame.
Yeah, Cayman's just mentioned, so this very analogous to, when queer providers, would out themselves, or, in the past, because just being able to see that there's others that do what you do, have your similar identity, and that they're, out there functioning, happy, successful, etc. I think that representation matters in all sorts of ways. Did you want me to touch base? And this is something, I'm not a legal person, but with medical providers, things are slightly different. We are still absolutely not supposed to have relationships or sex with patients. But there's less of the sort of absolute prohibition of any interaction. Like if I see someone in the grocery store, I'd been sort of, at least my understanding fuzzily of sort of a mental health therapy, is that you're supposed to kind of like not even acknowledge that person exists. And I have a friend who's a psychologist who used to literally coordinate with her therapist what parties that she would go to and the therapist would go to, so they would not be in the same space together. At the same time, I certainly don't go out of my way to be in this space where I know there's going to be patients. I've talked with other medical providers, and I remember one man I was talking with, a gay male Australian doctor, so I'm sure the laws are probably not quite the same, but talked about being at a bathhouse, with and chatting with one of his patients, and of course HIPAA, you don't want to talk about anything medical, but that it's more accepted to be like, you don't want to encourage interaction, but it's not as sort of as much of an issue. I did want to bring up one thing on that sort of, I was just talking with a friend of mine who's a JD recently about sort of the moral turpitude clauses most of us have on our licenses in terms of being an out provider, whether that's out as queer, out as kinky, out as polyamorous. And sort of would be curious to hear what other folks, how they've thought about that, and sort of how they've dealt with that in their personal life and professional lives.
So I'm going to leave that question on the table for a moment, because I want to create some space for Amy to comment about the balance
Thank you.
Oh,
of the
goodness.
original question.
So this is a colleague of mine, and I often do a course at lots of different conferences, basically, and it's called, what is it titled? Working within your community or something like that. And it's basically about being queer and working with queer folks, and being kinky and working with kinky folks, and being, ethically non-monogamous and working with other ethically non-monogamous folks. And everything is great in theory. doing this like complete separation of your personal life and your public life in theory is wonderful. But it's not the reality of how life works. Therapists and physicians and other providers, we're people, and we have personal lives that we have the right to live. I've had students tell me that they don't date because they don't want to see a client on an online app or something. And I'm like, do you want your job to be your entire life? Like, do you not want to have a partner someday? Do you not want to have a personal life? And well, no, yeah, I do. Well, then, like, dating apps is the way you have to do it nowadays for the most part. And so what happens if you run into somebody who's a client, on a dating app, or you run into somebody who's a client at a sex party or whatever? You walk away. You like you still have to live your life, and you still have to be parts of the communities that you belong to. And the reality is that you do the best that you can, right, to protect the client, um, as much as possible. And then you have a conversation about it the next time you see them and be like, hey, so let's talk about that. We ran into each other at a sex party. Like, let's have a conversation about that. And how did you feel when that happened? And then you figure out how both of you feel about the situation, and then you make plans to move forward, to try and avoid that happening if people were very uncomfortable, or you come up with a plan of action, right? But I'm really hesitant to tell people to travel 3,000 miles to participate in their community, right? Like, and this is true. This has been true for years with like queer providers, right? Like, all my friends who are queer providers are like, yeah, I see clients out all the time. I might wave at them and then we move on with our night, and it's not a big deal. And I think that we scare people like in school and licensure stuff, and it's like we get people so scared to like live their lives in the communities where they belong, that we're really doing a disservice to people and our clients sometimes, right? Like Richard mentioned and Hope mentioned, like having representation is really important, and knowing that, hey, my therapist is a successful person who's kinky, or my therapist is a successful person who's queer, or my therapist has two partners and they're successful and they're thriving in their life. Like, these are things that I can feel okay about myself when I see other people doing these things who are great, successful, wonderful, caring people.
Very
Yeah.
much.
And I just want to add on to that. I think visibility takes away the fear, the misunderstanding, the anxieties. It creates a space where we can all grow together. And on a question about that, I think for the providers listening, let's say they're not a part of the community, but they want to create a space where a client could come in for their regular physical exam. And the clinician wanted to create a space where that conversation could happen. What do you think would be some powerful ways for them to either set up their office or be able to ask an opening question that would create a space where a client could say like, oh, I could talk about this to my provider? Anything come to mind that might be a really good guidepost for some of our attendees today?
I missed the first half of the question, if you don't mind. Just
So,
saying things that we could do to make it more.
So to help our attendees who are providers all over the country, from big towns, small towns, that may not be part of the community, but want to let their clients know, hey, I'm going to give you a cue, a question, or something that would allow you to say, hey, you could talk to me about this. Like just some things that would create an affirming space for these conversations to happen. Any ideas that we could provide with our listeners today?
So I think
I'm gonna
starting out with collecting SOGI data, sexual orientation, gender identity information, when you're asking questions about that, and then you're asking questions about people's relationships. And one thing I always tell people is, when you ask about a patient's relationship, say, do you have any relationships? Do you have romantic relationships? Leave it open, put that S on the end of the question, because when you open the space for people to feel comfortable talking about their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their possible open relationships or relationships with more than one partner, you're also opening that space for people to feel more comfortable talking about other types of alternative sexual practices like BDSM and kink. When I was kind of preparing for this talk, I had asked a couple of my kinky friends, like, what would you want your doctor to ask you? And one of my friends was just like, if my doctor just asked me if I was like into kink, my mind would be blown and I would just love that. She just needs the invitation. And quite often, I mean, I ask about all of these things, but I'm a social worker, right? So when I'm doing an assessment, I'm asking about a lot of this stuff. But I ask about, do you have more than one partner? I asked, do you participate in any like kinky or BDSM things? And people who are kinky and into BDSM know what you're talking about. And people who don't might ask, and you can tell them, oh, like whips and chains and things like that. So it's like you can make the conversation happen without making people super uncomfortable. And if they ask you why you're asking, depending on what your role is, right? If you're a medical provider, well, we may need to test you for certain things if you're coming in contact with blood, if you're coming in contact with people's urine or different, bodily fluids, things like that. If you're a mental health provider, I want to understand your relationships and your support systems. And so these are questions that we ask. And if you just ask people, you would be surprised at the amount of information that they're willing to give you because people don't ask. Right. And so just simply asking the questions as part of that part of your assessment when you're asking social questions, when sexual orientation, gender identity, your relationships, that's the area where I ask it, and that feels most comfortable for me.
Yeah, I think just in general, taking a full sexual history, which is something as medical providers we don't tend to be very good at. Very much we're often stalled at the, do you have sex with men, women, or both? Which is like, regardless of the fact that it completely ignores gender spectrum. But the intake paperwork, like Amy was saying, I think using words that are sort of clues that we understand the community a little bit. So like talking about, when you have sex, do you have one partner, multiple partners? Do you go to parties? There's something called party and play, or PNP, that refers to something called chemsex, people who frequently go to parties where, say, crystal meth or other substances are being used. Using terms like topping and bottoming, although that can refer to both sexual things in terms of receptive or insertive, but that, also talking about impact play, talking about sounding, things like that, that sort of cue people into, you understand some of the terminology. And, that helps, I would say.
And one of the things that I find with all clients is it also depends on our comfort asking these questions, asking them casually, openly, without our own personal anxieties in play, without having judgment behind them, but just making it a casual part of the conversation of us connecting with our clients and patients. That makes it incredibly relaxing, not only in the moment, but it also sets up a future standard where someone could say, do you remember the first time I saw you ask me that question? Well, I have done a little experimentation and exploration, and I want to talk to you about some stuff. That foundation can go a long way to connecting us to all of our clients and patients. And I think our personal comfort, and hopefully everyone who attended today, your personal comfort rose just a little bit. We've got a great list of resources that were shared in the chat. Those will also be listed as resources when we connect. And the webinar will be up in about a week if you want to share it with other people. Yeah, Hope.
If you could, I was going to say, someone had put a question in the in the questions about medical providers. Can we lose our licenses if the vanilla board members find out about our activities? And then as a follow-up, whether doctors, therapists, etc., might also want to take on non-contact sex work, such as OnlyFans, dominatrix, stripping, burlesque. So to answer the first one, I would say yes, there's always a chance. I think that, malpractice is something that, something we kind of always have to think about, but having good patient relationships is sort of like the underpinning. And I think in general, if people like you, they're less likely to, like a particular patient to like want to come after you. But as far as the boards, I mean, I still really strongly worry about like the whole, we were talking about moral pulchritude, or sorry, moral turpitude is the expression. And they usually put it in the question about, have you ever been, had any issues with substance use, mental health, or moral turpitude. They usually like to put those three together, like all those horrible things. But anyway, sorry. That would be a nice thing to maybe follow up on, like maybe in an after.
Mhm. And it might be conversations to begin with the local boards in your state to open up that conversation to make change happen. Because that is where change happens, when we as community members start speaking openly and actively about our needs and how things need to adjust and change to recognize who we are as human beings in this field. I want to thank all of you. I know we lost Richard at the end here, but I do want to thank all of you so much for your wisdom, your openness, and your really direct conversations today. For those of us who are joining us, I want to just share a few other things that OutCare provides. If you are interested in getting an LGBTQ plus health training and are in need of CEUs, OutCare is now a CEU provider offering credits, and you can learn more about those courses at outcarehealth.org/training. Also, we have these amazing community building and support groups that take place every month. They're safe and inclusive spaces for LGBTQ plus folks to connect, and they're free virtual sessions, so you can join from wherever you are. Our next session is Shades of Pride, which is scheduled for next Wednesday for Black LGBTQ plus community. So we'd love to have you join there, outcarehealth.org/outreach. And as always, don't forget to join us next month. Our next Out Talk is what's missing from medical education, really looking at LGBTQ plus curricula in the real world and the training that people are getting and the training that they're not getting. This conversation takes place on September 21st, 3 o'clock West Coast time, 6 o'clock East Coast time. And we are going to have some representation from the AMA with us. And I think it's going to be a really deep and exciting conversation. So thank you all so much once again for sharing your wisdom and experience, and blessings to all of you. And we will see you next month.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.